In my last video, I talked about how 99% of atheists are very ignorant when it comes to Christianity, Christian theology, and specifically historical reconstruction of Jesus. And they're very biased and unfair, but I would like to say there is the 1% of atheists that really try to be even-handed in dealing with the historical sources as best to their ability. And I would like to say this person here, Autopsy87, is one of those 100. And actually, I check out his channel. I'm a Christian. I really enjoy watching some of his stuff, and I appreciate his perspective. He's trying to be balanced in things as regarding an atheist. From his perspective, he's trying to be balanced. He criticizes a lot of people on the left, and I think there could be a lot of agreement between me and Autopsy on political issues, because there's a lot of Christians that in politics, I think they're way off. Like, I would probably vote for Autopsy87 here before I'd vote for Ted Cruz. So that's one area of agreement we could have. And also, what's funny here, and this is a little side note, there's a lot of there's a strange alliance happening. I remember when in 2007 to 2012, atheists and us Christians would go at it, and they pretty much dominated us and would come at us hard and attack us. Now, a lot of the libertarian atheists and libertarian Christians, which is what I am, I'd consider myself a libertarian Christian, are coming into a strange alliance against the social justice warriors and Islam. So I see he has a lot of critiques of those, and on those I would join shoulder to shoulder with him against a lot of even other Christians on a political front. So I just find that interesting that this strange alliance is occurring between people that used to really go at each other hard. I see Christians defending atheists like Penn Jillette. I really like a lot of what he has to say, and I think many of the libertarian atheists, I would thumbs up to them, and Autopsy87 here is one of those. He did do a series here on the historical Jesus, and I would like to say he tries to be fair with from the perspective he's coming from. I'm gonna point out some errors here, and I hope Autopsy87 you take this in a good spirit. Other atheists, I just drill them because it's so bizarre. They don't believe Jesus existed at all. Most atheists I encounter on the internet don't think he existed. I don't think it's even in the option of believing that. And I know on here you cite Richard Carrier and David Fitzgerald as if they're some authorities in historical Jesus scholarship. Now I want you to hear me say a parallel of two people that let me just say this. Imagine I go, well, in geology, there's this debate about the Earth that there's some think that it's 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and there's some that think that it's 4 billion years old. There's a debate. Now, I don't think there should be certainty in this debate, but because you got some scholars, you got some scientists over here like Dr. Ken Ham and Dr. Kent Hovind who say it's 6 to 10,000, and over here you have some that say it's like who's the famous geologist, whoever over there, and I think I'm an old Earth progressive creationist. I think the Earth, and I think the Earth is billions of years old. I think the evidence points that way. I think the universe is billions of years old, 13.7 billion years old, and I subscribe kind of to the views of Hugh Ross on this, and I've debated a lot of young Earth creationists about this. But imagine me saying that, quoting Dr. Ken Ham and Dr. Kent Hovind on the issue of geology. That's about parallel to David Fitzgerald and Richard Carrier. They're not taken seriously in the scholarly community, in the SBL. Generally, they're not. They might listen to them, but they're going to go, get out of, ultimately they're going to say, you don't know anything of what you're talking about. Okay. So, and they're seen as fringe kooks, which is what they are. Robert Price is a different animal, but he even himself admits that his view is fringe. Robert Price doesn't think Paul existed. He thinks that all the letters of Paul were written by a school, okay, that claimed the Apostle Paul as some person. I heard him say that in a debate with James White. So just to let you know, that's how fringe kook those guys are seen. Now, they still could be right, and we're going to deal with some of the evidence you bring up here in your video. I'm not saying just because they're a fringe kook, they're totally wrong or they shouldn't be dealt with at all. We will deal with some of the things you bring. Well, I'm going to deal with some of the things you bring up. I'm not sure. Dealing with them would be a whole nother video. But because you do think he existed. Now, Robert Price. Oh yes, Robert Price quoted Rudolph Bultmann. Rudolph Bultmann was an extreme left, no friend. He was a very powerful scholar, liberal scholar within the scholarly community in the early part of the 20th century into about the middle of the 20th century, into the 1960s, and he had big influence even into today. Some still, but he's kind of seen as a dinosaur amongst many mainstream scholars. But he had a big sway, and he is no friend. Rudolph Bultmann is no friend to conservative evangelicals, okay, who do believe in the Bible as the infallible Word of God. He was no friend to them. He said that Jesus mythicists, those who think Jesus didn't exist, were insane. That's how left, this is how crazy the view is that Jesus did not exist, is seen amongst even him, okay, a guy who is so far left. But I do want to commend you on trying to be fair from your perspective, and you do talk about Bart Ehrman, and I think that's kind of who you're following. Now, I will say this, Bart Ehrman knows a lot about historical Jesus scholarship. He does, and he's really, he knows the field pretty well, but Bart Ehrman's main focus in his main area of expertise as a scholar is in what we call lower criticism, which is manuscripts, not higher criticisms, which is what Bultmann was, and even today, a lot of people like E.P. Saunders and N.T. Wright and James Dunn and Timothy Luke Johnson and Raymond Brown. Those are more higher critical scholars, whereas Bart Ehrman is a lower critical scholar dealing with the manuscript tradition. And his doctoral dissertation was on the Alexandrian text type. So that's his main thing, is not early Christianity. Now, I do want to say I studied early Christianity. I did it for my master's thesis. I did a thing on historical Jesus for my master's thesis. I have studied the field. I'm not an expert or scholar in that sense. I can read the original Greek text. I'm a little rusty right now, but I can parse the sentences really easily. And I did my doctoral dissertation in early Christianity, and my main thesis was to refute the Islamic view that Paul and Jesus were in discontinuity. That's the major argument that Muslims make, is that Paul and Jesus are in discontinuity, that Paul kind of made up what is today modern Christianity, and Jesus wouldn't have agreed with that. Little did I know I'd find this very helpful in debating atheists on the internet, because a lot of the information that I learned there deals with a lot of the things that they talk about, including in your video here. So I would like to start out here and say, again, I do appreciate you trying to be honest from your perspective. I'm just going to deal with some of the things here, and I hope you take this with an open mind, and I hope we can have a further dialogue about this, a further respectful dialogue about this, because I do see you're trying to be respectful. You're trying to be even-handed, and I appreciate that. Most atheists, they spout the Jesus mythicist view as if it's absolutely true, and to think otherwise is ridiculous, when actually their view, the Jesus mythicist view, is what is ridiculous. But I do appreciate you're trying to be respectful and deal with it be fair about it as far as you can, and you admit you're not an expert in the field. So let's go ahead and start your video here. and I'm going to respond to a few things.
Which proposed a bicameral.
Boring. Come
Alright,
on,
it's a
people.
commercial.
Let's debate something that actually matters.
So the question that has caused a lot of debate and conversation in both the Christian and the atheist communities deals with whether or not the historical Jesus actually existed. I have no illusions that this video will by any means convince one side or the other that they're in the wrong in their assessment of the historical Jesus, but rather I will present the arguments in which I agree and disagree on both sides of this issue. To start off, perhaps I should make my position clear. I am an atheist and an anti-theist. Further than that, I'm an atheist anti-theist who thinks that the odds of Christianity being true are about as likely as me being killed by a stampede of unicorns. After about 7 or 8 years of dealing with counter-apologetics, reading the arguments for both sides, and spending a good amount of downtime honestly looking at both sides of that argument, I can't even seriously entertain the idea that Christianity has anything more to offer in terms of universal truth than any other religion at any other time or place in human history. I say all of this to assure anyone watching that I have no dog in this fight, as they say. Whether or not the historical Jesus existed wouldn't shake me either way. That being said, I am in the camp who thinks that the historical Jesus most likely did exist.
Thank you, Autopsy87. Finally, an atheist who can look at this without blinding hatred. Even your demeanor is totally different than most atheists, and I just want to say I appreciate that. Let's keep moving on here.
I've both read and heard the arguments from both sides of this conversation. As a co-host on the Skeptic Fence show, link below, I've personally spoken to Bart D. Ehrman, who is a leading authority on the Bible and the life of Jesus, as well as a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Robert M. Price, who has a PhD in systematic theology and is currently professor of biblical criticism at the Center for Inquiry Institute. And David Fitzgerald, who is an author,
Okay, David Fitzgerald, again, I'm just going to say, when you say David Fitzgerald and you're quoting him as if he's some good source on the topic, just think of Dr. Ken Ham, okay, on geology or something like that, or some other creationists, and you're going to cite Richard Carrier. Again, Robert Price is a little bit different. He admits his view is fringe, and he can see, and again, he doesn't even think Paul existed. So anyway, let's keep moving on here.
Speaker and historical researcher. For those who don't know, Professor Ehrman is in the camp that the historical Jesus did in fact exist, while the other two mentioned, Robert Price and David Fitzgerald, are mythicists who hold an opposing view. I haven't personally spoken with Richard Carrier, but I'm currently reading his book.
Again, when you say Richard Carrier, to people that I've read in the field, Richard Carrier, his main area of study was not early Christianity or historical Jesus scholarship. I think it was in Roman religion or something like this. But anyway, I know his main thing wasn't this topic. So when you say Richard Carrier he studied the field a lot. Okay, you can give him that. Just like young Earth creationists, many are very intelligent. Many young Earth creationists that I deal with are very intelligent, and they will argue about why the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. They'll have their geological arguments, even more than me. I don't study geology all that in depth, okay? But to me, just the plain looking at the Earth and my reading of Genesis chapter 1 to 10, or Genesis, specifically Genesis chapter 1, doesn't fit what they're saying, especially with even them saying the universe is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, even though they're having different views on that. But that's a whole nother rabbit trail. But I want you to know, when you say Richard Carrier here, to people that have studied the field a lot, like myself, and a lot of people in the field that are mainstream scholars, you're saying Dr. Ken Ham, or you're saying Dr. Ken Hovind. That's what we're hearing, because he's not seen as any type of big authority figure in this area. So, anyway, that doesn't mean that he's wrong. It doesn't. Again, the evidence determines that. I'm not trying to appeal to authority. I'm just telling you how it sounds among the people that have studied this the most. He sounds like a young earth creationist. Let's move on here.
Proving history, Bayes' theorem, and the quest for the historical Jesus. But I think his thoughts will be included mainly because Fitzgerald's book, Nell, is essentially co-written by Carrier since he quotes Carrier nearly on every other page. Throughout this video, I'm not going to pretend that I in any way know more about this subject than the people I've just mentioned. I also am glad this conversation is happening because I find the argument from both sides completely fascinating. As far as what I'll be doing here, I'm just going to state the case as I see it and explain why I think it's most likely that a historical Jesus did in fact exist. Hopefully, if you hold an opposing idea, you will feel free to share it, and if you've never entertained the conversation either way, hopefully you'll find your interest piqued. Certainty. So to begin, I want to address what I think is a problem for both sides here. This is the problem of certainty. When dealing with history, we can only ever say that people or an event likely or unlikely happened. Sometimes we can see something as extremely likely, for example, George Washington crossing the Delaware, or we can see something as extremely unlikely, like aliens building Stonehenge. The thing to keep in mind is that stories in history do not have the luxury of being put in a lab and tested. So the best that can be ascertained is what most likely did or did not happen. One thing I found on this topic in particular is that both sides seem pretty adamant that their positions are correct, which is understandable, but go to the point of saying that their views are certain.
Because first off, the Jesus mythicist view that do say their view is certain are delusional. That's what it is. They're delusional. When you look at the evidence, Jesus certainly existed. He certainly existed. There is almost no question about that amongst scholars and historians who know this field well. And again, I'm not trying to appeal to authority. I'm just trying to tell you that the massive amount of evidence points to Jesus existing. And what a lot of these mythicists do is they just select certain evidence that they want to see and they ignore the massive amount of evidence that's against them. So anyway, I just want you to know that from my perspective, since you're being humble, I'm going to be humble. You're actually a good example of humility here, which is a good trait that many people should emulate. But I'm trying to say that in this area where I've studied, see, here's my dissertation, Islam and Christianity Comparative Study. This is on early Christianity. And when I did my master's thesis this is 70,000 words right here. And my master's thesis was 30,000 words, and this is about 100 pages. It's a 100-page book. That's what it is. I didn't go to Harvard or anything like that. I went to a local Christian university, but I did really get into this topic. Even after I was done with my doctoral dissertation, I continued to study this for years. Even today, I go back and visit it, of course, dealing with people on the internet, but I've studied this very thoroughly, and it is historically certain that Jesus existed. The mythicist view that say that their side is certain they're delusional. They're just delusional. It's like somebody saying, well, we shouldn't be certain if the earth is 4 billion years old. I mean, the bad thing here with those that say it's 10,000 years old and with 4 billion years old is that they're both certain. Well, that's because the young earth creationist is delusional. Okay, the old earth creationist, or the older people who believe the earth is I think it's 4.7 billion years old. That's what they would be accurate. They would be correct, and they would not be delusional. They would be accurate to what the evidence, the massive amount of evidence points to. That's what young earth creationists do, by the way, is they look at just this tiny little thing that they want to see, and they focus on this little evidence that they like, and then that's what mythicists do as well. So let's move on here.
I'm not convinced enough either way to say that I'm certain. I can only say what seems most likely. As we get deeper into the argument, I'll explain why. The Gospels. To ask whether or not the historical Jesus actually existed, we need to look at all of our earliest sources of information. The New Testament canon contains 4 Gospels, which most everyone is familiar with: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So who wrote these Gospels? It's unknown. What is known is that the authors of the Gospels definitely weren't eyewitnesses, and certainly
Okay. Let's have you finish your thought here.
weren't the disciples of Jesus known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These titles were given to these Gospels much later.
They were probably given to them much later for good reason. We know that the author of John does claim to be at least in touch with an eyewitness. Luke claims to be in touch with eyewitnesses in Luke chapter 1, verse 1 to 4, like you're going to state here. Mark, there's good reason to believe Mark was in touch with Peter as his major source for his gospel. There's a book out called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses that I've been checking out that makes a great case to show that the Gospel of Mark was in touch with Peter and for his information. And there's other reasons why too, that what we have in those Gospels, in Matthew too, there's some Matthew too, he's a little bit different than than Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, we know that he did use Mark, like I'm going to point out, and he used a hypothetical source called Q that we can see in Matthew and Luke, that they're using this source that seems to be very similar information that's not in Mark. But there's a good case to be made for Mark being his major source with Peter, at least apostolic tradition coming from the apostles. That's what everybody does concede, that Mark is in touch with apostolic tradition that came directly from Jerusalem from the 30s. Okay, many do think that it's developed and all this, but they do think that he's in touch with that. I think there's a good case to be made that Mark is directly in touch with Peter himself, the apostle Peter, because the main reason why is because Matthew and Luke use it just a decade later, and it's seen as and those are in two different parts of the Roman Empire, that Mark is seen as an authoritative document to use in the early Christian community. Why would that be? Because the source behind it they would have known would have been the apostle Peter, okay, who was a huge, who was the main leader in the early church. So let's keep going on here.
How do we know that? A good telling sign is that most of the general population of Judea in the first century were illiterate. Aside from that, the people in the area at the time spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek and at a later period.
But a lot of people were bilingual, okay? Mark and a lot of Paul himself, although Paul could speak Greek, Paul used scribes. So, this argument that Bart Ehrman, I know that that's an argument Bart Ehrman makes. It's not out of the question that they would use scribes, in the communities that they were writing to were Greek speaking, primarily Hellenistic, right? The core of the congregation were probably Jewish Hellenistic people, and they were writing to those, so they wrote them in Greek, okay, and then the traditions were passed down like that. So anyway, that's that kind of deals with that.
Not only that, but generally the Gospels don't even claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They were written long after the stories would have taken place, and by authors speaking a different language in a different part of the world, who gathered their Gospels from scattered writings and or oral tradition.
No, but they were in touch with eyewitnesses. So that's the thing. They were in touch with the apostolic community, the eyewitnesses. And see, the way it would have almost certainly happened, this is and this is where I could be going against a lot of scholars here, and this is my view, and a lot of other scholars hold this view. I'm not sure if it's the majority or what, I'm not sure, but I think there's good evidence to hold this, that the early apostles in Jerusalem, the 12 specifically, had these traditions about Jesus, and they crystallized them very early. Now, there were some adjustments here and there to the traditions, but they were crystallized pretty early. Like Q, for instance, even the Jesus Seminar, which is seen as an extreme left group of scholars, they think Q, or John Dominic Crossan, who's in that group, one of the main leaders, and Marcus Borg think the Q goes into the 40s, or even and I think it could even go into the 30s. James Dunn argues that the Q goes into the 30s. So and that's a sayings source that we have with Q. So that would be incredibly early, right by the time of Jesus. And this is Paul writing in the 50s in Romans, basically in Romans chapter 12. Q is very similar to Romans chapter 12. So he probably knew of these teachings when he had visited James and Peter, like you're going to cite here.
In the chart being presented, the Gospels are dated in chronological order. This shows when Jesus would have lived and when the Gospels were written in relation to that period. As you can see, the first Gospel, Mark, was written around 66 to 70 CE. This means that the first Gospel we have was written around 40 years after the stories it tells.
That's not too much. A lot of the sources we have, even from Suetonius, Tacitus, on the Roman emperors, were way before they had written. Okay, Josephus, right? He's going to write about things way before he's writing. So 40 years is not that much in antiquity. Okay, now if you're going to talk about Paul, we'll deal with him when you get to him. Let's move on.
About 10 or 15 years after that, the Gospels of Luke and Matthew were written. These Gospels base a good deal of their writing on Mark. The Gospel of Luke shares 50% of Mark's text, and the Gospel of Matthew contains the 90% reproduction of Mark. As David Fitzgerald puts it in his book, Nailed, which he was nice enough to send me a personalized copy, this means out of 661 verses in the Gospel of Mark, Luke's Gospel uses about 360 of the same verses, and Matthew uses about 607. The differences between Mark, Luke, and Matthew are also thought to be linked to a no longer existing source known as Q, which could have been either another no longer existing written gospel or more stories being passed down through oral tradition.
Now what we have, and David Fitzgerald is actually correct with that. Matthew and Luke are using Mark and a hypothetical source we call Q. But they're also using other traditions, okay, that we call Matthew and Luke because they're not in either of their gospels, or they're not in any other gospel. They're idiosyncratic to that gospel. Now Luke, the we sections, and there's the we sections in Acts demonstrate that Luke was in the Holy Land in the 50s when eyewitnesses would have been alive, and that's exactly what he states in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. So that, this is not some big, you're going to bring up the telephone game, which is from Bart Ehrman, and we'll deal with that too. But this is not some big thing to think that they just made up all of these things that happened with Jesus and his saying. So let's keep going.
Or perhaps a mixture of both. So our earliest gospel was written approximately 40 years after the events it describes. This is compelling when you think of how information that did survive made it to that point.
Okay, now this is Bart Ehrman. This is what Bart Ehrman argues, the telephone game. The problem with this Autopsy 87 is that it wasn't the telephone game. It was an entire community that heard Jesus preaching and teaching and saw what he had done during his life and ministry. They had thought this man was the Messiah of God, the prophet of God, bringing in the new age of the kingdom of God. This is what they thought, that their very salvation hinged on what the words that were coming out of his mouth and what he was doing. So this isn't just some telephone game where it doesn't matter, you can mess it up and it's fun, it's a part of that. No, it's an entire community of people all listening. So you have the community to check what if something was wrong. Like for instance, there was a big statue of Martin Luther King Jr. where there was a quote from him, but it wasn't exactly like he said. Some people got upset. Okay, now that's what would have probably happened with Jesus. A lot of his followers, if you come and you start saying things that aren't true to what Jesus said, or it messes it up. I do think they changed the form of it a little bit here and there, and they tweaked it. That was within an acceptable range to where it didn't change the essence of what Jesus was saying. But if you changed it completely, that's where you would have been shut out. And this is actually what's going to happen in the 2nd century with the Gnostics. When the Gnostics start coming in and they start making a totally different Jesus than what they knew from the Gospels. And the early church is going to reject them immediately. But so when people start coming in, they start saying, hey, Jesus said we're to hate our enemies. We're to kill our enemies and destroy them. The early Christians would have been like, back up. We know Jesus did not say that. Okay. So we're going to end here, and we'll continue on in our next video.